The world didn't stop for Layla just because she was exhausted. Los Angeles pulsed around her, neon lights flickering in puddles on the sidewalk, the hum of distant traffic filling the night. She stepped off the bus, tightening her hijab against the cool air, her fingers raw from carrying overstuffed grocery bags. The plastic straps dug into her skin, but she kept moving, her steps steady even though her body begged for rest. Her apartment wasn't far, just a few blocks through streets lined with corner stores and old buildings with peeling paint. The weight of the day pressed down on her, heavier than the groceries in her hands. The hours spent scrubbing hotel rooms, followed by the graveyard shift at the grocery store, left her drained. And yet, Ramadan required more from her. Fasting was easy. It was everything else that made it hard. The bills, the rent, the constant question of whether there would be enough food tomorrow. Inside the small one-bedroom apartment, Sammy lay curled on the couch, his small body buried under a blanket too thin for comfort. In the bedroom, Amina was still awake, her face illuminated by the glow of an old phone screen. She looked up as Layla entered, eyes sharp despite the late hour. "Did you get everything?" Amina asked, sitting up. Layla set the bags down carefully. "Just the essentials." Amina peered inside, her fingers grazing the rice and lentils. "No chicken. Maybe next week." She tried to sound lighthearted, but the words felt heavy in her mouth. Amina didn't push further, but the silence between them said enough. "I heard the landlord knocking again," Amina finally murmured. Layla's stomach twisted. She had been avoiding that conversation. The rent was overdue, and she had no idea how she was going to come up with the rest before the eviction notice arrived. "I'll handle it," she said, though even she wasn't sure how. Amina didn't argue, but the doubt in her eyes stung. Layla reached out, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Allah provides," she whispered. Amina gave a small nod, but Layla could see the worry lingering in her face. She turned away, unpacking the groceries, her mind racing with calculations. How many meals could she stretch out of this? Could she make the milk last the whole week? Would Sammy notice if she watered it down just a little? She hadn't meant to take so long at the store, but something had happened. It had started with a bag of dates. She had been standing in the dimly lit grocery aisle, fingers grazing the price tags, weighing each decision with quiet desperation. A bag of flour? Too expensive. Chicken? Not an option. She had moved toward the dried fruit section, looking for the one small indulgence she allowed herself during Ramadan: dates. Breaking her fast without them felt incomplete, like a prayer cut short. But when she reached out, the last bag was gone. Disappointment settled in her chest, absurd in its weight. It wasn't just about the dates. It was about everything. The exhaustion, the endless calculations, the feeling of barely keeping her head above water. And then a voice. "Here." She turned, startled. A man stood beside her, holding out the last bag of dates. He wore a beanie and a worn flannel, his dark hair streaked with silver, his beard a little unkempt. He looked familiar, but in that moment, recognition felt like a distant thought. "You should have it," he said simply. Layla hesitated. No, it's okay. You had it first." He offered a small smile. "I think you need it more." Something in his tone, gentle, certain, made her fingers tighten around the strap of her bag. She wanted to refuse, to insist she was fine, but the truth pressed against her ribs, too big to ignore. She reached out, taking the dates with careful fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod and turned away, disappearing down the aisle before she could say more. She thought that was the end of it. Just a moment of kindness from a stranger. But when she reached the checkout line, she felt his presence again. The cashier rang up her groceries and Layla began counting out the bills in her pocket, her heart thudding as the total climbed. Before she could hand over the money, a quiet voice said, "I've got this." She turned sharply. The man, the same man, was standing behind her, his posture relaxed, his hands in his pockets. "No," she started, but he had already slid a card across the counter. Her cheeks burned. "I can't." "It's okay," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "Really?" It wasn't okay. It was too much. But there was no pity in his eyes. No expectation. Just a simple offer given freely. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "Because I can." 3 words. Simple. Honest. She didn't say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because the words felt too small. Instead, she met his gaze, nodded once, and walked out of the store with her dignity intact and her heart a little lighter. Now, standing in her kitchen, the weight of the moment pressed against her. "How did you afford all this?" Amina asked again, her eyes scanning the bags, suspicion creeping into her voice. Someone helped, Layla admitted. Amina frowned. Who? Layla hesitated. Just, someone. The words felt hollow. She didn't know why she didn't tell Amina the full truth. Maybe it was the surreal nature of it. Maybe it was the fear of hoping for too much. But deep down she knew this wasn't over. And she was right. Later that night, as the city hummed and her children slept, there was a knock at the door. Soft. Measured. Layla's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. And yet, on the other side of that door, something was waiting. Something that would change everything. The knock came again, soft but deliberate, cutting through the quiet hum of the apartment. Layla froze, her pulse thrumming in her ears. It was past midnight. No one came by at this hour. Her first thought was the landlord. Maybe he had finally lost patience. Maybe the eviction notice wouldn't come on paper this time. Maybe it would be delivered in person with a voice that left no room for negotiation. She hesitated before unlocking the door. Amina stirred in the bedroom, sensing the tension in the air, but Layla held up a hand, silently telling her to stay put. The door creaked open an inch. And there he was. The man from the grocery store. Keanu Reeves stood in the dim glow of the hallway light, hands tucked into his pockets, his face calm but unreadable. His presence was an odd contradiction, at once familiar and completely surreal. Layla blinked, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. What are you doing here? His voice was steady, unassuming. I wanted to make sure you got home safe. Her fingers tightened. Why? He exhaled, glancing down the hallway before meeting her gaze again. Because I know what it's like. Layla didn't move. Part of her wanted to slam the door, shut out the strangeness of it all. The other part, the quieter, more desperate part, wanted to believe that kindness still existed in the world, even if it came in the shape of an A-list actor standing outside her crumbling apartment in the middle of the night. She studied him, searching for any sign of pity. There was none. A beat passed. Then another. And against every rational instinct, she stepped aside. Keanu walked in, moving carefully as if afraid to disrupt the fragile quiet of the space. The apartment was small, suffocatingly so, and for the first time, Layla saw it through someone else's eyes. The peeling wallpaper, the flickering kitchen light, the piles of unpaid bills stacked in the corner like silent accusations. She closed the door and turned to face him. If you're here to give me money? I'm not. The answer came so quickly, so firmly that it caught her off guard. I don't do charity, she said, arms crossing over her chest. Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering her. Neither do I. A silence stretched between them, thin and taut. Finally he spoke. I've been where you are. Layla scoffed before she could stop herself. Yeah. When? His lips quirked at the edge, but there was no humor in it. Before the movies. Before any of it. He gestured vaguely, as if the weight of his own past was something he rarely spoke about. I slept on benches. I lived in basements that smelled worse than this hallway. I know what it's like to count pennies at a register and pray you don't come up short. Layla stared at him, searching for a lie. She didn't find one. Something in her chest shifted, the edges of her resolve fraying just slightly. She sighed, rubbing her forehead. Look, I don't know what you want. Nothing. The answer was immediate. He glanced at the grocery bag still sitting on the counter. I don't know. You remind me of someone. Layla frowned. Who? Keanu hesitated. Then quietly, my mother. The words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Layla opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know what to say to that. Instead, she turned away, moving to the kitchen to busy her hands. She poured a glass of water, forcing herself to focus on the mundane, the normal, anything but the fact that Keanu freaking Reeves was standing in her living room, talking about his mother like it was the most natural thing in the world. She took a sip, the cool liquid grounding her. Finally she sighed. So what now? Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Now I help. Layla set her glass down a little too hard. I told you. No charity. I know. He paused, then added, a job. She frowned. What? I know someone. A friend. Owns a production company. Needs a reliable assistant. It pays more than whatever you're making now, and it's flexible. Layla stared at him, her pulse spiking. Why would you do that for me? Because I can. Those 3 words again. The same ones from the grocery store. Simple. Honest. Layla wanted to refuse. She wanted to hold on to her pride, to keep the walls up, to push away this bizarre, once-in-a-lifetime act of generosity. But then she thought of Sammy, curled on the couch under a blanket too thin to keep him warm. She thought of Amina watching her with worried eyes, old enough now to recognize the weight her mother carried. And for the first time in a long, long time, she let herself say yes. A small nod. Barely perceptible. Keanu saw it anyway. His expression softened just slightly. Good. Layla exhaled slowly. Good, she echoed. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt hope. Layla had spent years learning not to trust the good moments. They never lasted. Life had taught her that blessings came with strings attached, that hope was just a prelude to disappointment. And yet, here she was, standing in the break room of a production office that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, staring at her own reflection in the microwave door. She still couldn't believe it. The job was real. 2 days after that surreal night, Keanu had given her a name, an address, and a simple instruction. Go. Just try. She had hesitated, fighting every instinct that told her to walk away. But in the end she had shown up, dressed in the best version of herself. A second-hand blazer, worn but clean jeans, and a resolve that felt as fragile as glass. And now, after a whirlwind interview that felt more like a casual conversation, she had a job. A real salary job. She exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. First day jitters? Layla turned to find Ava, the office manager, watching her with a knowing smirk. She was a tall black woman with short, styled locks and the kind of presence that commanded attention without trying. Layla gave a small, sheepish nod. Something like that. Ava leaned against the fridge, crossing her arms. You're doing fine. Better than fine, actually. You're a natural. Layla huffed a quiet laugh. At what? Ava shrugged. At handling chaos. She gestured vaguely toward the hallway. This place is a circus. Welcome to the show. Layla smiled, but inside, her nerves still crackled like exposed wires. This world was so far removed from the one she knew. Directors pacing in hallways, writers throwing around ideas like confetti, assistants moving at the speed of light. And somehow, in the middle of it all, she was expected to keep up. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. It was hope. And that was the scariest part. She glanced at the clock. Almost 5. Ramadan had shifted her internal clock. Her body moved by sunrise and sunset, by the quiet patience of fasting and the small joy of iftar. She had packed dates in her bag, a habit she couldn't break. Ava caught her glance and grinned. You ready to go? Layla hesitated. I don't want to leave too early. Ava scoffed. Girl, it's your first week. No one's gonna fault you for leaving on time. Layla nodded, grabbing her things. She moved toward the exit, stepping into the warm evening air. And then she saw him. Keanu was leaning against his motorcycle, helmet tucked under one arm, as if waiting for a signal only he could hear. Layla's steps faltered. She hadn't seen him since that night. Hadn't expected to. And yet, there he was as casually as if this were normal. He noticed her hesitation and smirked. Relax. I'm not stalking you. Layla crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. Could have fooled me. Keanu chuckled, pushing off the bike. Just wanted to see how it's going. She studied him, searching for an ulterior motive. She found none. It's good, she admitted, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Overwhelming. But good. Keanu nodded, as if he already knew that would be her answer. You heading home? He asked. Layla hesitated. I need to pick up my kids first. He glanced at the bus stop down the street. The exhaustion in her eyes. The weight in her shoulders. Then, without a word, he held out his helmet. Layla blinked. You're joking. Keanu's smirk deepened. I don't joke about motorcycles. She shook her head. No way. Why not? I have kids, Keanu. I'm not asking you to join a biker gang, he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. Just a ride. One ride. Layla hesitated. The bus would take 40 minutes. The ride would take 10. Her kids were waiting. And so, against every instinct screaming in her head, she took the helmet. Keanu grinned. Knew you'd say yes. Layla shot him a glare as she fastened the strap. Shut up and drive. The engine roared to life beneath her, the vibration unfamiliar but oddly soothing. And as they tore through the city streets, wind in her face, heart pounding, something inside her shifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was alive. The city blurred around them, neon signs bleeding into the twilight as Keanu weaved through traffic with effortless control. Layla held tight, her fingers gripping the edges of her reality as the night air roared past. She should have been terrified. But she wasn't. She had spent years walking carefully, balancing on the edge of survival, afraid to misstep. But here, on the back of a motorcycle, she felt something she hadn't in years: weightless. The ride ended too soon. Keanu pulled up to the curb outside her kids' school, cutting the engine with a smooth flick of his wrist. The sudden silence pressed in, and Layla realized how loud her thoughts had been, how quiet they had become now. She slid off the bike, unfastening the helmet. Her legs felt unsteady, not from fear but from the sheer newness of it all. Keanu glanced at her, brow raised. "Not bad for your first ride?" Layla let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Not bad at all." The school doors opened and Sammy and Amina spilled out with the rest of the kids. Amina spotted her first, her steps faltering when she saw the motorcycle. Then her gaze snapped to Keanu, and her face did something between a gasp and a malfunction. "Oh, my God," Layla groaned. "Amina." But it was too late. Amina grabbed Sammy by the arm, whispering furiously before practically dragging him forward. "That's Keanu Reeves," Amina hissed, eyes darting between them. "Why is Keanu Reeves here?" Sammy squinted up at him. "Who's Keanu Reeves?" Amina gaped at her little brother like he had just declared the sky was green. Layla sighed, rubbing her temples. "Long story." Keanu, ever the professional, crouched down to Sammy's level. "Hey kid." Sammy studied him with the kind of pure, undistracted scrutiny only children had. Then with a casual shrug he said, "Cool bike." Keanu grinned. "Thanks man." Layla watched the exchange, something unfamiliar tugging at her chest. She had spent so long shielding her kids from disappointment, from the edges of the world that threatened to swallow them whole. And yet, here was this strange, ridiculous, impossible moment. For once, life was surprising them in a good way. Amina folded her arms, still suspicious. "Are you, like, our rich uncle now?" Keanu laughed, shaking his head. "Nope. Just a friend." Amina narrowed her eyes. "A friend who just happens to be a famous movie star?" Keanu shrugged. "Stranger things have happened." Amina opened her mouth, probably to argue, but Layla shot her a look and she begrudgingly dropped it. As they walked home, Keanu strolled alongside them, listening to Sammy's enthusiastic ramblings about superheroes and Amina's more reserved but undeniably intrigued questions about Hollywood. He answered everything like it was the most normal thing in the world. Layla found herself watching, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it didn't. When they reached the apartment, Keanu paused at the bottom of the stairs. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice as steady as ever. Layla shifted on her feet. She wasn't sure what to say. Thank you felt too small. Stay felt like too much. Keanu seemed to sense it. "Hey." His voice was softer now, just for her. "You don't owe me anything." Layla swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I know." He nodded. "Then promise me one thing." She raised an eyebrow. "What?" He smiled. "Don't be afraid to ask for help." Layla exhaled, something loosening inside her. "Okay," she said. Keanu gave a final nod, then turned, disappearing into the night the same way he had arrived, quietly, without expectation. As she climbed the stairs with her kids, Amina nudged her. "That was insane." Layla laughed, shaking her head. "Yeah, it really was." And for the first time in a long, long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, good things could happen to people like them.